There's something holding your husband in place that has nothing to do with love. And the reason he can't name it, the reason you can't see it, is that it doesn't exist in the visible world at all. You've watched him try to pull away, maybe not in words, maybe not in any gesture you can point to and say, see, he wanted to come back. But something in the way he acts tells you that what holds him there isn't simply desire. It isn't simply that he prefers her. It's something deeper than preference. Something that operates below the level of his will. And every time you've tried to make sense of it with the logic of a normal situation, with the reasoning of someone who understands how feelings work, how people make choices, you've come up empty. Because what's operating here isn't ordinary. And Padre Pio knew that. He saw it 1,000 times in his confessional over 50 years. Wives who arrived with the same question you are carrying right now. Why can't he just leave her? Why does something keep pulling him back? And Padre Pio gave those women something that no counselor, no therapist, no well-meaning friend had been able to give them. A name for what was holding the husband in place. Not a vague spiritual concept. A precise description of 5 invisible bonds that form between a man and a woman through shared sin, and that operate with a force that human willpower alone cannot break. That's what this video is about. By the time we're done, you're going to understand exactly what those 5 bonds are, how each one formed, what each one is doing right now in the invisible realm of your marriage, and you're going to have Padre Pio's specific prayers for breaking each one. Not one prayer for all 5, a specific prayer for each bond. Because Padre Pio was very precise about this. Each bond responds to a different spiritual key. And there is something he revealed about the 5th bond, the one he called the hardest, the one that creates the most resistance even in the wife who prays, that no one expects to hear when they get there. I'm not going to tell you yet what he said about it. But when you reach that point in the video, it is going to completely change how you've been understanding everything that came before. Before we go any further, is any of what I've described so far something you recognize in your own marriage? That sense that something invisible is at work, something that has no rational explanation. Tell me in the comments. You don't have to share more than you're comfortable sharing. Just that recognition. That community of women below this video is praying alongside you, and your words there matter more than you know. And now, let's get into what Padre Pio actually taught about the root of all of this. Padre Pio spent 50 years listening to marriages in crisis from the other side of a confessional grate. He heard things that no marriage manual, no psychology textbook, no relationship seminar has ever documented. And across all those decades and all those confessions, he observed something consistent. Something he described in his own words to those who knew him most closely. He said that when a man forms a bond with a woman through sin, through physical intimacy, through emotional secrets, through shared spiritual rebellion against God, something happens in the invisible realm that goes far beyond what the two of them feel for each other. Tie forms, a real spiritual tie, one that the man himself cannot see, one that the wife can only feel in that unsettling, inexplicable way she feels it, but cannot touch or address with any human tool. Padre Pio called these ties bonds, and he was very specific. There are distinct types. They don't all form at once. They build layer by layer as the relationship between the husband and the other woman deepens. And they cannot all be addressed with the same prayer. That's why, he said, so many wives pray faithfully and see nothing move. Not because their prayer is wrong, not because God isn't listening, but because they are praying against one bond while 4 others remain intact underground. Hold on to that. It matters more than almost anything else I'll say today. The first bond Padre Pio identified is what he called the bond of the secret. And this one forms before anything physical ever happens. It forms the moment a man begins to tell this other woman things he doesn't tell his wife. Not because the information itself is special, but because the act of hiding it creates a private world between them. A world with a door that only opens from the inside. And every secret shared is a brick in the wall of that private world. Here's what makes this bond so dangerous and so difficult to detect. It doesn't look like a bond at all from the outside. To the husband, it feels like friendship. It feels like being understood. It feels like relief. The relief of saying something to someone who doesn't carry the weight of 15 years of shared history, shared disappointment, shared struggle. It's the relief of a clean slate. And that relief, Padre Pio said, is a trap. Because the clean slate isn't real. It's an illusion created by the enemy, who knows that the easiest way to introduce the other woman into a man's heart is first to make her the keeper of his secrets. Do you recognize this in what you observe in your husband? The sense that there are conversations happening somewhere you can't reach? Things he knows, things she knows that exist in a space you're not allowed to enter? That's not paranoia. That's the bond of the secret doing exactly what it was designed to do. Let me tell you what happened to a woman who came to Padre Pio with this exact situation. Her name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that she had been married for 11 years. 3 children. A husband who had never, in all those years, given her a single reason to doubt him. And then something shifted. Not dramatically, there was no moment she could point to. Just a slow, almost imperceptible closing. He started leaving the room when his phone buzzed. He started having conversations she wasn't part of. He started coming home later and explaining less. And when she asked, he was kind, patient. He didn't argue. He just told her nothing was wrong. And she knew, the way a wife always knows, that something was. She arrived at Padre Pio's confessional not with proof of anything, just with that knowing. And Padre Pio didn't ask her what her husband had done. He asked her something she wasn't prepared for. He asked her, "What did you stop telling him?" She didn't understand the question at first. She was there about her husband. Her husband was the one who had closed. Her husband was the one keeping secrets. And Padre Pio repeated it, gently, but without moving from it. "What did you stop telling him?" "Not recently. Before." "When did you and your husband stop being each other's first listener?" She went quiet, and then she began to cry, because she knew exactly when. It was years before the other woman ever appeared. It was in a season of exhaustion and unspoken resentment when she had stopped bringing her heart to him and he had stopped bringing his to her. And the space that opened up between them, the space of all the things neither of them said, that was where the bond of the secret took root. Not in her husband's failure. In the silence they had both allowed. Padre Pio told her, "The prayer that breaks the bond of the secret isn't a prayer against the other woman. It's a prayer for the restoration of intimacy, the intimacy of souls before any physical intimacy. Because the bond of the secret formed in a silence that existed before her. And it breaks when God begins to fill that silence with something real. That's everything. And it changes the entire question, doesn't it?" The second bond Padre Pio named is the bond of the body. And this is the one that most people think of when they think of an affair. The physical connection. The intimacy that, by its nature, creates a spiritual tie that the scriptures themselves describe as two becoming one flesh. And Padre Pio was very clear. This bond is real. It is not metaphorical. When a man enters into physical intimacy with a woman, something binds in the invisible realm. Something that does not simply dissolve when the encounter ends. Something that remains pulsing in the spiritual atmosphere of that man's life. Pulling him back, creating a compulsion that he often describes as not being able to stop himself, not being in control, as if something outside his will is operating in him. And do you know what the wife feels on her end of that bond? She feels exactly that pull. She doesn't feel it as attraction to the other woman. She feels it as the absence of her husband, as his energy going somewhere she can't follow, as a kind of gravitational drain, like something is slowly pulling him out of orbit from their life together. Padre Pio knew this. He said that the bond of the body is particularly cruel to the wife because it operates as an absence she can feel but cannot explain. She knows something is being taken. She doesn't always know what or by whom. And she lives with that knowledge as a constant low-grade ache. But here is what Padre Pio said about this bond that changes everything. It is not unbreakable. In fact, he said, it is the most responsive to prayer. Because the bond of the body was formed in an act, and acts in the spiritual realm can be addressed by acts of their own. The act of a faithful prayer, offered with a clean heart, has power over a physical bond in a way that no human argument, no emotional appeal, no ultimatum ever could. He said this, and I want you to hold this very carefully, because the bond of the body pulls the husband back through something that feels to him like desire. But when prayer begins to work on it, what the husband experiences is a slow, inexplicable loss of that pull. Not a dramatic moment, not a lightning strike, a slow dimming. He starts to feel, without knowing why, that what once compelled him no longer compels him with the same force. That the pull is losing its edge. And as that pull dims, something else, something more familiar, something associated with home, with his wife, with the life he built, begins to feel more present. Padre Pio never promised a timeline for this. And I am not going to promise you one either. But he said, and he was very specific about this, that a faithful prayer never returns empty. That the bond of the body has never survived a sustained and sincere prayer because it was formed in the darkness, and prayer introduces light into exactly the space where that darkness operates. And now we've arrived at something deeper, because the third bond Padre Pio named is the one that surprises most people when they first hear it. He called it the bond of the wound. This is the bond that forms not through intimacy or secrets, but through shared pain. Your husband and this woman, somewhere in their connection, share a wound. Not the same wound, but wounds that recognize each other. And that recognition creates a bond that is, in some ways, more powerful than physical attraction. Because it answers a need that goes all the way to the core of a person. The need to be understood in their pain. Here's what Padre Pio observed about this bond. When a man is carrying an unprocessed wound, from his childhood, from a failure he's never forgiven himself for, from a disappointment he's never put into words, and he encounters a woman who carries something similar, something in him responds before his reason can intervene. Because for a wounded person, recognition feels like safety. And safety, when it's been missing for a long time, can feel like love. Do you recognize that in what you're watching in your husband? Not just desire. Something more like refuge? Like she provides him with something that feels like rest from a pain he's been carrying too long? That feeling you have right now, Padre Pio saw it too. And he had a name for it. And more importantly, he had a prayer for it. He said, "The bond of the wound cannot be broken by addressing the bond itself. It can only be broken by addressing the wound underneath it. Because the bond is not the problem, it is a symptom. The wound is the problem. And when God touches that wound, when healing begins at the level of what was actually broken, the bond of the wound loses its anchor. And a man who was drawn to another woman because she seemed to understand his pain begins to look back toward his wife. Not because she offers the same thing the other woman offered, but because, with the wound beginning to heal, he no longer needs the wound to be witnessed. He needs something else, something only she can offer." Padre Pio was very precise about this. He said the prayer for the bond of the wound should never ask God to remove the other woman. It should ask God to touch the wound in the husband's heart, the wound that existed before she arrived, the wound she never actually healed, the wound only God can reach. And when that prayer is prayed faithfully, God moves at the root level, not at the surface of the affair, at the root of the pain that made the affair possible. I need to pause here for a moment. If you've made it this far in the video, if you're recognizing in what I'm describing something that names what you've been unable to name for a long time, it's because this isn't the only thing Padre Pio taught about this. There's more. Each bond has its own specific spiritual answer. And each week on this channel, I post new revelations from Padre Pio about marriage and the spiritual battle surrounding the husband. Subscribe right now and hit the bell so you're the first to receive them. Subscribe, hit the bell, and let's keep going, because what comes next is the bond that generates the most questions. And the one almost no one sees coming. The fourth bond Padre Pio called the bond of the altar. And this one is the hardest to explain, and the most important to understand. When two people enter into repeated sin together, something spiritual forms between them that is the dark mirror of a covenant. They haven't stood at an altar. They haven't made promises. But in the invisible realm, repeated shared sin creates something that functions like a binding, a mutual claiming. And it carries a spiritual weight that Padre Pio said operates like a yoke. The husband can feel it. He often describes it to himself in the rare moments of total honesty as feeling trapped. Not in a way he resents, in a way he can't explain. A sense of obligation that has nothing to do with his feelings. A pull that persists even when his feelings have changed or cooled. How many times have you watched your husband do something that made no sense? Stay when he seemed to want to leave, return when you thought the pull was fading, and wondered, what is that? That is the bond of the altar. That is the invisible covenant formed through repeated shared sin, operating as a false obligation in his soul. And here is the real cruelty of this bond. Because it operates like obligation, it can actually override your husband's feelings for you. He might, in the deepest part of himself, want to come home. He might feel the emptiness of what he's doing. He might miss what he had. But the bond of the altar creates a compulsion that says, you can't leave her. Not because he loves her. Not because he chose her deliberately. But because something in the invisible realm of what they've done together has claimed him. Padre Pio saw this pattern hundreds of times. He described it to one woman in his confessional as a chain that looks like love from the outside and feels like a cage from the inside. And he said that the husband who is bound by the altar bond is often the most desperate, because he can feel the cage, but he cannot see the door. And without someone who knows where the door is, he cannot find it alone. Let me tell you about a woman who brought this exact situation to Padre Pio. She had been separated from her husband for 2 years. He had moved in with the other woman. By every external measure, the marriage was over. Her family had told her to let go. Her closest friends had told her the same. She had begun, very reluctantly, to believe them, but something in her couldn't surrender. Not because she was in denial. She was clear-eyed about what had happened. It was something quieter than that. A sense that God had not released her from praying. That there was something still happening in the invisible that the visible world hadn't caught up with yet. She traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo and arrived at Padre Pio's confessional. And instead of telling him about her husband, instead of laying out the situation he presumably already knew, she asked him, "Is it over? Should I stop praying?" And Padre Pio asked her something she did not expect. He did not ask how long she had been praying. He did not ask about her husband's behavior. He asked her, "Have you ever prayed for her?" She told him she hadn't. She told him she had tried to forgive. She'd made many efforts at forgiveness, but praying for the other woman specifically was something she had never done. She said honestly that she wasn't sure she could. And Padre Pio told her this: the bond of the altar cannot be broken by a prayer against what was built. It can only be broken by a prayer that introduces into the situation a grace that is bigger than the covenant formed through sin. And the grace that is bigger than sin, he said, is always charity, the highest form of love. The love that prays even for the one who took what doesn't belong to her. Not because she deserves it, but because that act of love introduces a power into the invisible realm that the dark covenant cannot withstand. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked him, "If I pray for her, genuinely, not as a formula, what happens?" And Padre Pio said, "What happens is not your business. That is God's business. Your business is to pray. And when you pray that prayer, something in the invisible shifts that no human power could shift. Because you are no longer fighting the bond with your own strength. You are introducing God's love into the exact space where the enemy built his chain." She went home and began to pray for the other woman. Not easily. Not without resistance. With enormous internal struggle, actually. But she prayed it. For 30 days she prayed it. And on the 31st day, her husband called. Not with words of return, not yet. But with a question she had never heard him ask. He called and said, "I don't understand what's happening to me. I feel like I'm waking up from something. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." She didn't tell him what she'd been praying. She just said, "I'm here when you're ready." 6 weeks later, he was home. Now, right now, while the weight of that story is still landing, there's someone specific in your mind. A friend, a sister, a woman you know who is in the middle of exactly this and doesn't have a name for what she's watching. This video can give her that name. Send it to her right now. Not because I'm asking you to. Because Padre Pio spent his entire life making sure no wife who came searching for help went home empty-handed. And today you can be the one who carries this to someone who is sitting alone with a question she can't answer. Now we come to the fifth bond. The one I mentioned at the very beginning of this video. The one that Padre Pio said is the hardest. The one that generates the most resistance in the wife who tries to address it. And I want to be honest with you about something before we get there. When I describe this bond, and when I tell you what Padre Pio said the prayer for it looks like, your first instinct may be to say no. Your first instinct may be to feel resistance so strong that you want to skip this part entirely. That resistance, Padre Pio said, is exactly how you know you've arrived at the root. He called the fifth bond the bond of the void. And it is different from all the others because it didn't begin with her. It began long before she existed in your husband's life. It is the void that forms in a man's heart when he loses contact with God, with his purpose, with his sense of why he exists and what he was made for. Padre Pio described it as a spiritual hunger that a man will fill with whatever is available, because the hunger is real, and the soul cannot tolerate a void. It will always reach for something to fill it, and the enemy knows this. The enemy knows exactly which void is present in which man, and exactly which substitute appears to offer what the void is crying out for. The other woman is not the bond of the void. She is the substance your husband reached for to fill it. And that is a crucial distinction. Because if she disappeared tomorrow, if every external tie between them were cut, the void would still be there. And it would reach for something else. Because the void doesn't care about her specifically. The void cares about being filled. And until the void is filled by the only thing that can truly fill it, your husband will always be in danger of reaching outward for a substitute. And do you know what the real tragedy of the bond of the void is? Your husband doesn't know this about himself. He genuinely believes it's about her. He genuinely believes that what he feels is specific to this woman, this connection, this particular thing they have. He doesn't know that what he's experiencing as a connection to her is actually the temporary relief of a starving man who found food. Any food, not good food, not nourishing food, but something that temporarily addressed the ache. Padre Pio saw this with absolute clarity. He said, "The man who is bound by the void is the most blind, because he thinks he has found something when he has only found distraction. And you cannot argue a man out of a distraction when he is still hungry for what the distraction is pretending to provide." How many times have you tried to use logic with your husband? How many times have you tried to make him see, with evidence, with history, with the reality of everything they actually have together, that what he's choosing doesn't make sense? And how many times has that logic failed to move anything? That's not because you're wrong. It's because logic cannot reach a void. Logic lives in the head. The void lives at a level below logic. And what fills a void is not an argument. It is a presence. A specific, irreplaceable presence that only God can introduce, and that only a faithful prayer can invite. Here is what Padre Pio said about the prayer for the bond of the void, and this is the instruction that creates the most resistance, the one no wife expects to hear, the one he said has the most power of all 5 prayers. He said, "The prayer for the void is not a prayer about the husband at all. It is a prayer about you. More specifically, it is a prayer that you pray for your own heart, for your own void." Because Padre Pio observed that in most marriages where the husband has been drawn away by the bond of the void, there is a corresponding void in the wife, a place in her own heart where she stopped reaching toward God, stopped asking for her own spiritual filling, stopped believing that she herself was worthy of being pursued by divine love. And when a wife addresses her own void, when she begins to receive, through prayer, what only God can give, something shifts in the invisible atmosphere of the marriage. Not because of any mystical mechanism, but because the woman who is being filled by God radiates something that is, in the spiritual realm, irresistible. Padre Pio called it light. A woman being filled by God becomes light. And the void in the husband, which has been feeding on a substitute that cannot truly fill it, begins to recognize that light. Not immediately, not all at once, but it begins to orient toward it. This is the turn Padre Pio saw 100 times. The wife stops fighting the affair and starts praying for herself, for her own healing, for her own filling. And the husband, who has been reaching outward for what was never going to satisfy him, starts to feel a pull in a different direction, back toward his home, back toward his wife. Not because she changed her strategy, because she stopped fighting in the visible and started allowing God to move in the invisible. That's everything. And now I want to give you Padre Pio's specific prayers for each of these 5 bonds. Not one general prayer, a specific prayer for each one, with the specific instruction Padre Pio gave for how to pray it. For the first 3 nights, you're addressing the bond of the secret, the bond of the body, and the bond of the wound. These are the surface layers, real, powerful, but more responsive to prayer because they formed more recently and more consciously. Before you begin the first prayer, place your right hand over your heart. Not as a ritual, as an act of intention. You're telling God, I am bringing this to you from the inside, not just the outside. Then pray this, Padre Pio, you who saw what is invisible and touched what is untouchable. I ask you to intercede for my husband before the throne of God. I ask that every secret formed in darkness between him and this other woman be brought into the light of God's truth. Not to expose, but to dissolve. Not to shame, but to free. I ask that the bond of secrets that holds my husband in a private world I cannot enter be pierced by the light of the Holy Spirit. That every whispered confidence be heard by God and answered with a truth more compelling than any secret they have shared. Lord, restore to my husband a desire to speak his heart to me. Restore to our marriage the intimacy of souls that was stolen. I trust this to you. I release the timeline to you. I ask only for movement. Amen. Pray this prayer on night 1, night 2, and night 3. On night 2, as you pray it, bring specifically to mind a memory of your husband confiding in you. A real moment, a specific one, when he brought his heart to you and you received it. Hold that memory as you pray, because memory is one of the most powerful tools of restoration in the invisible realm. It reminds both you and God of what was real between you and what can be real again. For nights 4, 5, and 6, you're addressing the bond of the body and the bond of the wound together. Padre Pio said these 2 bonds are often intertwined. The body responds to a wound, and healing the wound begins to loosen the body's tie. Before you pray nights 4 through 6, pray out loud. Not whispered, not silent. Spoken aloud. Padre Pio was specific about this. Spiritual bonds operate in the realm of what is declared. Your spoken prayer carries authority in the invisible that a silent prayer does not reach in the same way. Pray this, Saint Padre Pio. I come to you with a bond one cannot see and cannot break with my own hands. A bond that holds my husband through his body and through his wound. I ask you to stand before God on his behalf and on mine. Lord, I ask that the tie formed through physical union between my husband and this other woman be addressed by your mercy. That what was joined in darkness be released by your light. And I ask something harder. I ask that you touch the wound in my husband's heart that existed before she arrived. The wound he has never shown anyone. The wound he may not even know is there. Touch it, Lord. Not to expose it, but to heal it. Let my husband feel, in the place of his deepest hidden pain, the presence of a God who sees him completely and has never looked away. Let that healing begin to free him from every tie formed in the darkness of his unaddressed pain. And let him begin, slowly, to look toward home. Amen. Hold on to that prayer. It works at a depth that you will not immediately feel. But Padre Pio was very specific. When this prayer is prayed faithfully over 3 nights, there is movement at the level of the wound that begins to surface in the husband's behavior. Not always in ways the wife can identify, but in a restlessness, a questioning, a dissatisfaction with the substitute he has been living with that begins to feel to him like waking up. Night 7. This is the prayer Padre Pio gave for the bond of the altar. And this is the instruction that creates the most resistance in the wife who reaches this point. I told you at the beginning that there was something here that no wife expects to hear. This is it. On night 7, Padre Pio instructed the wife to pray for the other woman. Genuinely. Not as a formula. Not as a strategy. As a real prayer for a real person whom God also loves. Padre Pio was not asking the wife to approve of what this woman did. He was not asking her to pretend the wound wasn't there. He was asking her to do the one thing that introduces a grace into the invisible realm that is bigger than the covenant formed through sin. And he said, with complete specificity, that the bond of the altar cannot be broken by any prayer that stops short of this one. Because the bond of the altar was formed through a false covenant, and the only thing more powerful than a false covenant is a genuine act of charity. And charity, at its highest, is the willingness to pray for the one who harmed you. This is the prayer for night 7. Lord, I pray now for her name, if you know it, or simply the woman who is with my husband. Not easily. not without everything in me that resists this. But I choose it. I choose it because you loved her before she ever arrived in my marriage. Because her soul belongs to you, not to her choices. I do not ask that she be punished. I ask that she be touched by your presence, that she encounter, in whatever way you choose, the truth of who she is and who she was made to be. I release any claim of mine over what happens next. Lord, break the false covenant, not by force, by truth. Let every tie formed in the darkness between my husband and this woman be dissolved by a love that is greater than both the sin and the bond it created. I trust this entirely to you. Amen. Padre Pio never promised how long this prayer takes to move what it moves. What he said is, this prayer, prayed genuinely, never fails to introduce something into the invisible realm that was not there before. And that something, that specific grace, is the most powerful single force available to a wife in this situation. Nights 8 and 9 bring you to the bond of the void. And as I explained, this is the prayer that turns inward. Before you pray nights 8 and 9, sit in silence for 5 full minutes. Not praying yet, just sitting, with your hands open in your lap, with your eyes open, looking up. Padre Pio was specific about the eyes open instruction. It is an act of honesty with God. It is a way of saying, I am not hiding. I am not pretending. I am here exactly as I am. Then pray this, for both nights. Lord, I bring you my own void tonight, not my husband's. Mine. The place in me that stopped reaching for you. The place in me that began to believe I was not worth being pursued by divine love. Come into that place. Fill what is empty in me with your presence. Let me receive what I've been waiting for my husband to give me, and let me find it in you first. Transform me, not so that I become more appealing or more strategic, but so that I become who you designed me to be. A woman filled by you, a woman who carries your light in her own soul, and let that light, in whatever way you ordain, be the thing my husband begins to be drawn toward. Not because I am trying to draw him, but because your light, Lord, is irresistible to the void in every man. And you know exactly where the void in my husband is. You made him. Meet him there. Amen. That is the full 9-night prayer for the 5 invisible bonds. Padre Pio was very specific that these prayers should be prayed on 9 consecutive nights without interruption. Not because the number is magic, but because consistency of intention, maintained across time, builds in the invisible realm a spiritual presence that scattered prayer cannot build. The wife who prays once with great emotion and then stops creates a spark. The wife who prays faithfully across 9 nights creates a fire. And now I want you to think about your husband. Not what he did. Not where he is right now. Not the pain of what you've watched unfold over these weeks or months or years. Just him. The man who stood somewhere and made a promise. The man God designed, before the void formed, before the bonds were built, before any of this, to be exactly the husband you were meant to have. Because Padre Pio never prayed against a husband. He prayed for the man underneath the wound. The man underneath the void. The man who was bound by invisible ties he hadn't even consented to fully. And when he prayed that way, from love for the husband, not from the wound of the wife, things moved that had seemed immovable. So here is what I want you to do tonight. Before you sleep, find a quiet place. Place your right hand over your heart. And pray the first prayer, the prayer for the bond of the secret. Put your husband's name wherever the prayer says, my husband. And believe, even if you feel nothing yet, even if the visible world looks exactly the same tonight as it did this morning, that something you cannot see is being moved. That the void holding your husband in place is beginning, one layer at a time, to be addressed by a love that is greater than any bond the enemy can build. If something in this video moved something in you today, if there was a moment where something you heard finally gave a name to something you've been unable to name, tell me in the comments what landed most for you. You don't have to share details. Just that inner recognition. That small act of honesty is already the beginning of something real. Give this video a like if something in it touched you. That like carries this teaching to more wives who are sitting alone tonight with a question no one has been able to answer. You can be the one who changes that for someone else. And in the next video, I'm going to reveal something Padre Pio said about the moment a husband begins to turn, what Padre Pio called the sign of the turning. A specific interior movement that happens in the man before any visible change appears, that the wife almost always misses because she's watching in the wrong place. Don't miss it. It will completely change what you look for and what you do when you see it.